I was born in Egypt. I'm Coptic, from the Christian minority that's slowly being decimated in Egypt as we speak. And one of the things is that just before the uprising in Egypt, I was there for a period of 4 months doing some research. And unfortunately for me, although others were happy, people that loved me, I ended up leaving just before things started, although not before the bombing of the church in Alexandria. But where I want to start today is to let you know that last week at York University, I gave a lecture on Napoleon and Orientalism. But more significantly than that, I discussed briefly, as a result, the French Revolution. And one of the aspects I noted was that the French Revolution lasted 10 years, from 1789 to 1799. And I found that fact quite comforting. While the French celebrate their republic, whatever you may think of that, on July 14th, marking the day of the storming of the Bastille, the Egyptians will come to mark January 25th, 2011, as the day that they broke through their own terror and stood up against a regime that was both irrelevant in relation to legitimate governance and terrifyingly repressive. And so we have yet to see the end of year one of this uprising. And the French Revolutionary decade saw reversals, victories, contradictions, and massacres. And the French lived through a reign of terror that saw more than 40,000 people killed. And even after these 10 years, the French lived through the reestablishment of the monarchy under Emperor Napoleon. And however short-lived that was, that still marked yet another hiccup in their struggle for independence, but not so much independence, but for recognition of the working classes in France. So the fate of Egypt, I think, is still in question, and it will be years before we can trace the meanings of the uprising, the many costs of the uprising, and also the possibilities that this uprising might yet permit. I'm still holding a little bit of hope. My hope is dwindling, but nonetheless, I'm still mildly optimistic. Today, one of the things I want to address is how we got to the momentous events of January 25th, what happened, and what things look like now. So I'm going to begin with how we got there. And so I think that how we got there is the Red Riots in 1977 during the Sadat regime were some of the largest organized demonstrations in Egypt since the revolution of 1919, when Egyptians, during the revolution of 1919, were fighting against British control in Egypt and in protest against the exile by the British of Saad Zaghloul, who was head of the Waft party, and he was also the leader of the movement. He was called the father of Egypt for Egyptians. And at that time, let me move here because apparently this is how I change slides. Very exciting. And this was the flag that they were using at the time. And one of the things I find interesting about this flag is it found a kind of resurgence during the Egyptian uprising in 2011. God love you, Fred. And that was because it symbolized the bigger Muslim community and the smaller Christian community living together, supposedly under one sky. And especially during the revolution of 1919, the revolution was a secular revolution, even though they continued to struggle with the same kinds of questions they're struggling with today. How do we integrate Islam and secular politics? But let me just go back to the bread riots for a second. In 1977, the riots were not in protest against the British, but they were more in protest against immediate material concerns that working people had in Egypt. And thousands protested against the removal of government subsidies on food, particularly the rising cost of bread, which had been fixed for a very long time at 1 piastre per loaf. And the reason that that's significant is because bread, even though, thank you, we have no picture, okay? Even though we have no picture, bread comprises a large portion, especially of poor people's daily diet in Egypt. And in fact, what happens, it's very different than here, is that on a daily basis, people go out to the bakery and buy bread. And they buy, for example, let me just give you an example, a family of 3 or 4 might buy 12 loaves to have with breakfast. So it really does supplement their meal, if not make up their whole meal. So it's meaningful suddenly when those subsidies are removed. Anwar Sadat was then president of Egypt, and he had agreed to cut these subsidies, of course, in response to the demands of the IMF, World Bank, their demands for structural adjustment, particularly during the 70s and the oil crises of the 70s. And this was part and parcel as a result not only of the economic changes due to the moves of OPEC at the time, but it was also as a result of Sadat's move toward a liberal capital vision of Egypt and away from his predecessor, Nasser's more socialist-leaning tendencies. And it was then known, his program, Sadat's program, was then known as Infitah, or more commonly, his open door policy. And so basically what open door policy meant was kind of the celebration of liberal capital and really a turning away, in fact, a total negation of the 18 years of Nasser rule. And these bread riots were so huge that, in fact, they not only did students come out and intellectuals come out, but regular folk came out all over Egypt in small towns and big cities. And they were the demonstrations were so massive that Sadat reinstated, and I really say that in quotes, reinstated the emergency laws, because really, when you hear about the emergency laws, as we hear now about the uprising, these emergency laws have been in place since the 1967 war with Israel. So they're there whether there's an emergency or not. Every day is an emergency. So Sadat reinstated these emergency laws, and factories and universities were closed for 10 days in order to make sure that when these people returned to their work and to their studies, that they wouldn't have time to organize in the meantime. Of course, no social media at the time. People in Egypt were yelling in the streets, "Thieves of the Infitah, people are famished," or "Ya batal el-abur fin el-futur," hero of the crossing, where is our breakfast, right? Because Sadat was celebrated as having crossed Sinai in order to make war with Israel in 1973. And some even were calling for the return of Nasser as indicative of their lack of faith in Sadat and his Western-leaning policies. But the regime was shaken nonetheless, and different sites of opposition, leftists who wanted to call attention to the pitfalls of capital, the alliance of the regime with the West and Western economic ideals, and also the conspicuous consumption of Sadat and his wife Jehan and their cronies. And on the other side, religious extremists who burned nightclubs as sites of Western decadence and the decay of moral values. And these, along with other opposition forces, were severely repressed by the Sadat regime. And I remember during that time, people would stop me and they would say, "No, isn't Sadat a great man?" And it was a complicated desire to fulfill, to answer those people, yes, he is a great man. Because while externally he was seen in one way, internally he was much more fiendish than his public image might suggest. And even though he attempted to court different factions of society and tried to appear magnanimous, his rule relied more and more on repression. And a month before he was assassinated, he had jailed members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and one of the members eventually, a month later, fatally shot him. Mubarak took power without any vision whatsoever, and really no one was more lackluster than Mubarak. And in fact, people joked that the reason that Sadat had felt safe to keep Mubarak as his vice president for so long was because he seemed like a man with no vision or no ambition whatsoever, and didn't appear to be a threat to Sadat and his regime. He was a stodgy anti-intellectual, and he reprimanded men of his own regiment when he caught them reading. Sadat had a capitalist dream, wanting to join the developed world and be a global player, but Mubarak's mantra for 15 years was that he saw his role as safeguarding the country and ensuring stability from chaos. That became like his rallying cry, stability from chaos. And the first chaos he seemed to have saved us from was when he was brought into power, was the chaos that brought down Sadat, his assassination. And then later the chaos that happened in Iraq and Kuwait. And 10 years later, he was trying to save us again after 9/11 showed perhaps a further need to safeguard the nation from extremist factions. So the country also with Mubarak went through a period of really stagnant production. And in the summer of 2004, a movement people began to agitate. And the Kafaya movement, I'm sure many of you know about it, which really means enough in colloquial Egyptian, was really the moniker for Egyptian Movement for Change. And it really was a grassroots coalition which drew its support from across the Egyptian political spectrum. It was a platform for protest against Hosni Mubarak's presidency, and especially at that point, that he might transfer power directly to his son, Gamal, because he would come and give talks and he would say, and later, for the stability of the country, it's always about our stability, that maybe it would be best for the country's stability to put Gamal in power after I leave power. And people in the Kafaya movement, along with other more fearful and silent Egyptians, were completely against that. And in a way, how the Egyptian cultural life operates is because it is so repressive, things work at the level of humor. So a lot of jokes came out about Mubarak, and people began to call him Pharaoh Mubarak, right? Monarchical rule where you just, give power from father to son. And the people in the Kafaya movements, one of their cries was that there was a blurring of the lines between power and wealth, and that the regime's cruelty and coercion and total disregard for human rights required a change. And even though it first came into public attention in 2004 and achieved a much greater profile during the presidential elections of 2005, it subsequently lost momentum. And there was a lot of internal dissent, and there was leadership change, and more general frustration at the apparent inability of Egypt's political opposition to force the pace of reform. Also, it really was, in a way, living under Nasser and Sadat and then Mubarak, really the youth were living with parents who could be considered the defeated generation. And really it's not that there wasn't political will, but there was a great deal of fear and lethargy in the population. And Kifaya was not a youth movement. It was really a conglomeration of intellectuals, but it provided the first big demonstrations really since 1977. There were other demonstrations in between, but I'm not going to mention them. What Kifaya asked for was no transfer of power from father to son, right? To address the deteriorating economy, to address what they called social neglect, and things went on that way. But as I said, the movement lost momentum. But on April 6th, 2008, there was a marked shift, right? Using Facebook and blogs and SMS and independent media and word of mouth, activists and workers in Egypt organized strikes and protests, and demonstrations. Maybe we can have the next one just in case it's meaningful. Oh yeah, okay, thank you. They called it, these protesters called it April 6th, 2008, the Egyptian Intifada. Supporters called for civil disobedience. They asked everyone to stay home from work and avoid making any purchases. And the strike began as an initiative, really, by the El Mahalla workers in El Kobra, and their rallying cry was taken up by activists all over Egypt, and it attracted, at least digitally, over 64,000 members. Even the Islamic Labor Party joined in, and what was interesting is these are the flyers. This is the content of the flyers that were seen all over Egypt at the time. It says, all national forces in Egypt have agreed upon April the 6th to be a public strike. On April the 6th, stay home, do not go out, don't go to work, don't go to the university, don't go to school, don't open your shop, don't open your pharmacy, don't go to the police station, don't go to the camp. You know what that is? We need salaries allowing us to live. We need work. We want our children to get an education. We need human transportation means. We want hospitals to get treatment. We want medicines for our children. We need a just judiciary. We want security. We want freedom and dignity. We want apartments for youth. We don't want price increases. We don't want favoritism. We don't want police in plain clothes. We don't want torture in police stations. We don't want corruption. We don't want bribes. We don't want detentions. Tell your friends not to go to work and ask them to join the strike. People stayed home. Now, people stayed home either because they were afraid, and I would say a lot of them were afraid, and some of them stayed home in solidarity. But it kind of looked like that quite a lot of people were in solidarity, whether it was for fear or for other reasons. And at that time, when they were agitating for this general strike, one of the things that people were afraid of is they said Egyptians will not be able to mobilize. And that was one of their biggest fears. January 25th was purposely chosen because of its significance. And for me, this is a really important thing, you know, because people said, oh, it's the domino effect in North Africa. And when Abu Aziz self-immolated, burned himself in Tunisia, people said Egypt is next. But one of the things I want to say is I think that Tunisia helped to build momentum, but that Egypt also had its own impetus for the revolution, for its own uprising. And on January 25th, it is really a national holiday. It's a national holiday in Egypt, commonly known as Police Day. Okay? The holiday commemorates and is a remembrance of 50 police officers killed and more wounded when they refused British demands to hand over weapons and evacuate the Ismailia police station on January 25th, 1952. And Hosni Mubarak in 2009 declared January 25th as the official holiday, National Police Day, recognizing the efforts of Egyptian police to maintain security and stability in Egypt and recognize their sacrifices. And I think the reason I keep repeating security and stability is to tell you that this mantra is still going on. So what happens is, this very language, okay, the very language of our security and stability, is the language of the regime. First, as a diversion away from issues challenging the people, the majority of the ever-increasing over 88 million population, and mounting these exaggerated narratives in order to shore up the potential for chaos that the Mubarak regime was always keeping at bay. The regime continually reiterated that it was the only thing between the people and chaos and internal strife. And one has to say that that seems to be proving true, and there are reasons to suspect that this is not coincidental. Moreover, the press, predominantly state-controlled, even though there are endless call-in shows and talk shows, these do not offer anything of a real critique, of a real forum for debate. In fact, they're kind of like the drug that puts you to sleep. Okay? If indeed the military, and this is one of the things that was happening early on during the uprising, if indeed the military is only holding power and indeed understand themselves, as they argued that they ought to be understood, as the transitional government in order to maintain the machinery of the state until elections could be held, at which point elected government would then replace this transitional military government, it seems that they are slow to leave. With cries in the Western media, the military is the friend of the Egyptian people, and Egyptians themselves initially chanting, the army and the people are one hand, but you just don't know what it's doing, okay? As time wears on, it becomes more doubtful that the military and the people are one hand. And ousting Mubarak only partially cleansed the regime, and the patronage system and the extent of the corruptions and those who profited from it have a great deal of investment in a particular working of the state. Meanwhile, the kind of daily instability that has been infused in the system is a way for the military, transitional government, to express their own cautionary tale to the Egyptian population. The major difference being that while Mubarak insisted that his regime stood between the population and chaos, the military government is saying, we are only a transitional government. We have no political teeth to stem the chaos. And yet the military has had no problem baring its teeth to its citizens. Almost done. Salafis. People are hearing a lot about Salafis and the Salafi movement that has kind of is paying Egypt a visit at this time. Salafis are an extremist Wahhabi religious sect. They literally did not exist as a political force, nor as a social force before the events of January 23. They came out of literally thin air. And so this new faction that's really just adding more fuel to the fire is suspicious on a variety of levels as a possible agent provocateur financed by militant groups or by Saudi Arabia or by the military itself, and also inflames events and lays in opposition to a secular state or even a state which fully would recognize the rights of its minority groups, right? And because, in fact, as people are beginning to uncover things about what's going on in Egypt, they discovered that some of the sectarian violence, for example, the bombing of the church in Alexandria, on December 31st, 2010, was really organized by Mubarak's thugs, right? What are known as the Baltageya. In fact, Baltageya in Arabic means thugs. And so the plainclothes security forces that number 500,000 are known commonly on the streets of Egypt as the thugs. Okay, almost done. Mubarak resigns. People want end of emergency laws, freedom of speech, end of corruption, justice and a responsive non-military government, end of police brutality, free and fair elections, so on and so forth. At the beginning of the uprising, the Muslim Brotherhood did not want to participate, only joined the uprising a few days later. And partly the fact that there is really no organized opposition except for what is called in Egypt the Forbidden Muslim Brotherhood, people have been unable to organize due to the repressive arm of the state, not only under Mubarak, but under Sadat and before him under Nasser. What happens is people think of the military government. We can move forward, if you don't mind. Isn't that beautiful? Okay. I want to say something about this. I'm actually going to end in 2 minutes, but one of the things I thought about this was this scene was unimaginable for most of us. And I think that is one of the most important points about these uprisings, that I myself both kept looking at the television and Facebook and everywhere else, okay, that I could find, because sadly I was already back here. And one of the things that I thought was, please do it, please do it, please do it. I don't think you're going to be able to do it, okay? And just not to actually affect deep and binding change, just to affect a lack of fear and a standing up against this devastating, inertia-producing 60 years of the military. It's important to realize that Nasser was a military man, Sadat was a military man, Mubarak was a military man, and the only thing we have going for us with the transitional government is that no particular man has identified. They're still identified as a group, and that actually might be one of our saving graces. Elections are coming up on November the 28th. And in fact, people from who helped to organize this very uprising on January 25th are trying to organize to form their own party and to put forward candidates, but not put forward presidential candidates. One of the lovely things, one of the parties that has come forward, called the Justice Party, is calling for is not a particular ideology per se, but a set of propositions for change instead. Although I think in the end, their ideology comes to the surface anyway. But what they're saying is we may be unable to organize a leader for this particular election, supposedly being held in 10 days. I wouldn't hold my breath. But the thing about that is they're saying, no, we want to be ready in 10 years from now. And again, I find that comforting. Except who is going to take power and what is happening between the Christians and the Muslims and how is daily life lived, we're going to discuss in the workshop. But I just want to show you some of the people up for potential president. 1977, Khalid Mohammed, who helped instigate the April 6th movement and helped mobilize people. Tantawi, head of the military council, not our friend. Okay, here is Mohammed Musa. What's interesting about him is just as Nasser had his own head man at one of the leading newspapers in Egypt, Mohammed Hassanein Hakel, this is the man that Sadat had. Long political career. The man who told us, Mohammed al-Baradei, the man who told us he wasn't going to run, because he's been out of the country for so many years, but gee, why not?